There's been a lot of discussion around VRAM lately, and the simple fact that games need more of it than ever. That's where AMD's mainstream 7600 comes in. It's a nice upgrade from last gen, but it has one potential flaw. It still includes just 8GB of VRAM, so I thought this would be a great opportunity to see whether 8GB is enough for a lower end card, or is this simply a problem with only higher end GPUs? The answer may surprise you. Welcome everyone to Gamer Melt. AMD's 7600 non-X GPU is here, and pretty much every leak on it was spot on. So if you follow this channel, you already know all the specs and don't need me to go over it again. Okay, if you don't follow me, I'll quickly recap, but make sure you subscribe to learn about all that before anyone else. My faithful viewers can just skip ahead. Okay, so I'm left with you. I'm just kidding, you're great too, don't worry. The card comes with 32 compute units or 2048 cores, a game clock of 2.25 GHz, and a boost of 2.66. It also comes with 32 MB of Infinity Cache and 8 GB of GDDR6. And it's the memory that we're really going to focus on today. A lot of talk has been going on about VRAM, and the fact that even higher end GPUs have been brought to their knees. But is this really a concern for a lower end GPU? Speaking of, the 7600 has one very welcome change. The price has actually been lowered from last gen down to $269. Well, it was $300, but they changed the price literally the day before I was to film this. But regardless, in 2023, should we expect more than 8GB for $269? And do we need it? Those are actually two different questions. For the first part, I'd say yes and no. You may not know, but AMD actually released their R9 390 with 8GB all the way back in 2015, and that was just $330. Of course, with inflation and that being GDDR5, it's somewhat understandable. But then there's the mid-range 8GB RX 480 that released for $240. So I'd argue we should at least get a bit more. Unfortunately, both AMD and Nvidia are sticking with 8GB. So this brings me to the second question. Do we need more? And to that, I'd say sort of. See, in most games, AMD's new 7600 does incredibly well, getting some very nice performance at 1080p and even 1440p. But in some of the newer games, the 8GB frame buffer becomes an issue. Starting things off, we have Forspoken, a game that certainly hasn't been well received, but it may have partially been because some people thought it looked way worse than it was supposed to because they had 8GB cards. Case in point, when the game doesn't have enough VRAM, it doesn't really stutter or anything like that. Well, it does when you run the built-in benchmark, but I'll get to that in a second. Instead, while you're playing, even at 1080p, the textures will randomly disappear. I mean, we're talking they completely vanish out of nowhere, and it just looks terrible. It looks like there essentially aren't any textures at all, and it happens very often starting at the beginning of the game. But as you can see, it's still fairly smooth as far as stutters. And even though it shows stuttering while running the benchmark, the score doesn't reflect that. So it seems like the card is fine here, but it isn't. Now, you may be thinking that the frame rate isn't good enough anyway, and that's because everything is turned all the way up. But even if we turn the textures to standard at ultra settings, we still run into this issue, though we're getting playable frame rates. What's worse, if we turn everything up but enable FSR while the frame rates are great, we still run into this problem. And don't forget that this is at 1080p. To make sure it was in fact the VRAM and not the GPU speed, I put in the RX 6700 XT, which comes with 12GB of VRAM, but is relatively close in terms of performance. And as you can see, all the texture issues disappear, even with everything maxed out. The next game I went through was Hogwarts Legacy, which is a fairly demanding game. Here, it plays fine at 1080p Ultra, but as soon as you turn on ray tracing, even on low, things completely break down. Textures begin to randomly appear and disappear all over. Of course, you'll notice that it's mostly not playable with this GPU anyway, but even when we turn on FSR 2.0 and the actual rendered resolution is extremely low and the FPS is playable, it mostly does the same thing. Not only that, but if you turn the quality down to medium with low ray tracing, it still does it. Here, I also used the 6700 XT on low ray tracing, and as you can see, it didn't have any of these texture issues. Even with ray tracing on high, it didn't have any problems, even though it had similar frame rates to the 7600. And it's not just ray tracing. If you turn ray tracing off and play at 4K, the textures will act wild as well. Here, the game isn't playable with dips well below 30 FPS, and if you turn on upscaling it does help. Simply put, ray tracing isn't the only issue here. The next game I tried was the new Resident Evil 4 Remake, and this one had less issues with textures and more with simply being jittery and cutting out. With it set to 1080p Ultra and ray tracing turned on, with anything over 2GB on textures, the 7600 would stutter frequently, even when the FPS was completely fine, though it did get some big drops in frame rates when a lot was going on. Turning down the textures definitely made the difference, but there's at least a little room for playability if the card had more VRAM, but not by too much. Finally, I tested it in The Last of Us Part 1, and this game is fairly known for not being the best port in terms of optimization, but it has been a little while since the game came out, and it's gotten at least one really big patch. Here, with the game set to Ultra at 1080p, it was a stuttering mess. Every few seconds, it would stall for a second or so, and I even had a crash happen when changing settings. Either way, 8GB simply isn't enough for this. So the question was, do you need 8GB? Well, for the most part, no. Most games are fine at 1080p, even at ultra-high settings, but it does seem that newer games do need more VRAM, especially when you turn on ray tracing. And upscaling doesn't help much in most titles. Specifically, with the 7600, it is still possible that your VRAM becomes bottlenecked before the actual GPU speed. And in some ways, this is worse than having a slower card because when the card is slow, you can do things like sacrifice FPS for quality depending on the genre. But when you don't have enough VRAM, you're done. It's basically game breaking, from big stutters to disappearing textures, so you're simply forced to lower settings. Luckily, most games are completely fine, and depending on the game, it only really breaks at very high settings, some of which the 7600 is already too slow to handle anyway, so it doesn't matter. Then again, with upscaling, it would be able to handle it, if it weren't for the VRAM. At the end of the day, it's up to you. If you think games will continue to raise VRAM requirements, you may not be happy with 8GB. But you can always just lower settings as well. There's always gonna be bottlenecks at this price point, and for $269, it's really not bad at all. With that said, I wouldn't suggest a more powerful GPU with 8GB, as the VRAM will likely become an issue even at lower settings. Oh, and if you're interested in picking one of these up, I'll have affiliate links down in the description below. It doesn't cost you anything more, and it helps the channel out. So while that does it for today, do you think 8GB is too little? Let me know down in the comments below. Also, I do hope you liked the video. I know it was a bit different from my usual style, but if you did, give it a thumbs up and make sure to leave a comment. And as always, have a great day.